The theologian tries to give a comforting answer with this theory that explains how evil can exist in a universe governed by a good, sovereign God. The traveler, on the other hand, is trudging through the muck and the mire of the road. He just wants to know how to deal with evil. Welcome to 167, where we talk about practical theology, bridging the theology and doctrine of Christianity and the realities of day-to-day life. I call this the 167 because theology is so often seen as the domain of that hour on Sunday when we gather with other believers to worship. But listen, theology isn't supposed to be limited to one out of 168 hours in a week. This time we spend together is going to be devoted to looking at the ways in which the things that we learn and know about God applies to every one of the 168 hours in a week. The truths about the triune God and the doctrines of the church were never meant to be separated from life. They were meant to be central to a life in full. Doctrine was not meant just to be some kind of academic exercise. It was meant to plant the guideposts and set out the boundary markers of the life of a Christian. The study of God, theology, is not meant to just fill our heads with knowledge, but to fill our hearts with hope. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say your pastor preaches a passage from Romans and he mentions how important propitiation is. Maybe he even adds a little detail about expiation, contrasting the subtle distinction between the two concepts. You hear that, but then you're left to wonder, how's this going to help me with my kids or help me manage my money? How is knowing the difference between the two of these concepts, or even just the definition of propitiation itself, how's that going to help me with my struggling marriage? Or how's it going to contribute to an important decision that I have to make about my career or some other aspect of my life? This is where theology and doctrine start to become distant from life. This implied distance makes it seem as though theology is only the domain of the pastor or the professor, but this certainly isn't the case. Listen, if we read the Bible, if we hear the Bible, if you and I experience God's word in any way, theology applies to us. You and me, we're all theologians. Let's start here with defining terms. Theology is the study of God. And when I say study, I'm not saying that in the sense that we observe and catalog a bunch of information it's really interesting, but it never gets used. I would call that knowing about God. For the Christian, though, God is not an object of observation like a rock is to a geologist. He is our subject of study, for sure, but he's also the object of our adoration and gratitude. God has and he wants a deeper relationship with his creations, and just knowing about God isn't going to cut it. Theology should motivate us to know God. Minister and theologian John Mackay gives this memorable and really easy to understand illustration to kind of portray this artificial division, knowing about God on one hand and actually knowing God on the other. He describes this scenario where two characters sit up here in this Spanish balcony, I think, but you can put it anywhere you want. And they sit up on this balcony and they overlook this road that runs below the balcony. And travelers go back and forth on that road. And so they look down on these travelers. They overhear the conversation. They observe the way that the travelers are moving back and forth. Because they're distant, because they're not actually traveling on the road, these two guys sitting up in the balcony feel free to theorize about the nature of the road. Like, how can it exist at all? Does it really lead someplace? See, they don't really get involved with the road. The travelers, on the other hand, have a whole different set of issues. They have real life problems. When they look at the road, when they interact with the road, when they are moving slowly or quickly along the road, they're wondering, can I get where I want to go? Where does this road go? Can I really make it all that way? While the pair up in the balcony are free to theorize about how the road, exists or where it goes or the difficulties of traveling on the road, the travelers down here on the road, that's you and me, by the way, we have very concrete issues that we want to deal with. We have very real day-to-day problems and issues that rise up in life and questions that come from those. The theory up here and the life down here portray that distinction between knowing about God up here, they know about the road, and then actually knowing the road as you and I walk along it. The theoreticians, the guys in the balcony, and the travelers along the road, they're talking about the same thing. It's just that their problems are different. In the church, this takes the form of putting theology and theologians up on the balcony while the rest of us muddle around down here on the road looking for some practical way to apply what the theologians are telling us. Take the topic of evil that comes up all the time within the church family. The theologian tries to give a comforting answer with this theory that explains how evil can exist in a universe governed by a good, sovereign God. The traveler, on the other hand, is trudging through the muck and the mire of the road. He just wants to know how to deal with evil, how to have even the tiniest bit of mastery over it. The traveler wants to know how she can be good when evil is all around her. The distant theologian wants to form an answer, but those of us that are traveling, man, we want to have life. And the reality of our life, the 168 hours that you and I have each week, is a moment-by-moment challenge to live out what we believe to the best of our ability. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm calling this video series 167 in recognition of the hours that we spend apart from the hour that we have in church on Sunday. Ideally, what I hear from the pulpit and what is central to the prayers of my elders, and even what I have, what I talk about with my brothers and sisters, I hope that something in that applies to my life on Monday morning when I get up to go back to work. Knowing God, as opposed to knowing about God, well, that should have influence on every part of my Monday morning. Gratitude for the grace of the sovereign God should result in praise, and that praise, that should include a reminder of Jesus as propitiation, as the atoning sacrifice that paid the debt for my sin, the horrible price for my sin that I can admittedly sometimes be cavalier about. Well, that should be an ongoing corrective. There's not a minute of my Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, for that matter, that is not touched by my relationship with God. In the next episode, we will start right there with the question of who God is and what he's like. God has revealed a number of his personal characteristics through the Bible. He reveals these things not so we'll catalog and analyze them, kind of bind them up, and then put what we discover in books and put them up on the shelf. No, God reveals himself so that you and I can know him and love him and serve him. When we treat what God reveals about himself academically, there's always a risk of resentment on our part. God reveals that he is in sovereign control of every aspect of the universe. And as such, he commands our loyalty, obedience, and worship. Academically, as a human being who also wants to be sovereign and in control of my own little world, I can be prone to resenting that God. But listen, when I go beyond knowing the facts, beyond knowing the theological theories about God, and I seek to know God and know him personally and have his personal influence on my life, well, that resentment goes away. It's a relationship of love, and it's a relationship of being loved. I hope you'll join me on this journey. There is really nothing more important that we can devote ourselves and our time to than knowing the God who sent his beloved Son to stand in your place, in my place, and he took our penalty. There's no greater act of worship than for us to take what he reveals about himself and to have relationship with him in that context. Certainly that relationship calls for our obedience. But listen, the more that we can apply theology to our lives, the more we understand that obedience is beneficial to us, that it's not a burden but a pleasure. It's a privilege. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode. Until then, know God and be blessed. God bless you.